Bergen, Norway.
Beautiful. Yeah, which it is. So, Dan, for the benefit of people who are watching this, which genre do you write in, and how do you define that genre?
So I suppose most typically I would be a horror author, although I think for marketing purposes we're supposed to call that supernatural thrillers if you want to sell any books. Horror doesn't sell. Remember that, kids. So I've written other things as well, bits of sci-fi and little bits of literary fiction, and I suppose some kind of more speculative, undefinable fiction as well, and kids stuff. But horror kind of is most naturally, I suppose, where I kind of fit. How would I define that? I suppose I kind of agree with Neil Gaiman that it's what defines the genre is often if you leave those bits out, it's not that anymore, right? So, it's not really erotica if there's not some rumpy pumpy, right? Or if there's not love and a relationship and people falling out of love, back in, it's not really a romance. So I suppose for horror, there's got to be some element of extraordinary threat. So that, Jaws would be a horror novel for me, even though it's not really a supernatural threat. It is an extraordinary threat. Science fiction can veer into horror because technology, ends up being an element of that threat, or it could be. So broadly speaking, and I would say that or another thing that probably defines horror is that it's most explicitly comfortable with metaphor. In fact, it's essential. It's useful in all fiction. I don't mean that in the sense of prosaic metaphor. I mean it more in terms of thematic metaphor. So I'm not talking about writing a sentence where we construct a simile or a metaphor as we might do.
Yeah.
Or if you're into cognitive linguistics, I'm not talking necessarily about ontological metaphors. But definitely the idea of, the monster stands for something usually in the character, like it's usually a negative mirror, a dark mirror of the character, or it reflects their flaw or whatever.
Yes, so you mean typically we'd look at, say, the Godzilla movies, and because they were coming out of Japan in 1954, we've got an audience that were sort of Godzilla is meant to have been created by nuclear radiation, and we've got a country that was sort of coming out of issues with nuclear.
Yeah, it as metaphors go, it's actually one of the least metaphorical metaphors, because it's the start of the movie. It's mushroom clouds and
yeah,
in the South Pacific, and iguanas getting irradiated. But I mean, literally, Godzilla or Godzilla is the personification of an existential threat. Okay, that would be quite difficult to kind of put your finger on. So yeah, it's a literal personification of that threat. It is the literal personification of all the many and varied fears of childhood. I would argue maybe the metaphor is the monstrousness of growing old, in that kind of book, so it allows you to kind of plow quite deep thematic issues. I suppose if you're writing that kind of horror, I mean, there's more splatterpunk, and I think splatterpunk does this sometimes, but it's not a necessary and sufficient thing for it to absolutely happen. I just think that if the writer's skill is on point, then that's really in any kind of writing, you want deeper thematic resonances.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And it's interesting that you define horror as sort of something that's maybe not supernatural, but outside the natural, outside the normal. So you mentioned Jaws, which I suppose it's a possibility that we could get a giant shark that goes around eating people off. Is it Martha's Vineyard, where it was? Well, it was meant to be called.
It's technically with the book. the Amity Island is in the movie, but the book is really quite explicitly just the Hamptons, so it's upstate New York. So it's a kind of interesting one to think about metaphor in terms of Jaws, because the movie is a very clever adaptation of a novel, which obviously the novel's maybe 80,000 words and it's much more complex and stuff. And there's certain things that adaptations like, so for example, in the novel, Hooper, who's the the marine biologist that's Brody's wingman in the movie, does have that function obviously in the book, but he's also the shark on land. He's a metaphor for the shark on land who pursues Ellen, Brody's wife.
Diddles
really, but yeah, and it's a much more complex metaphor in the book. I mean, Jaws is about money. It's on a deeper thematic level. It's not about a shark, right? The shark is a metaphor for money and the things that we'll do for money. And the book just has a few more layers to it. So there's obviously the kind of the threat, the physical threat to the town and its business and its industry, and it poses the question: what would you do for money? Will you trade lives for money, or the risk of that? And that's really what the movie does, right? It's like, what will you go through to do that? Whereas, like in the book, you also have an additional level where Brody isn't a blow-in, where he grew up. He grew up in the town, and he's a blue-collar guy who married up. He married a Hamptons girl who's really from New York, but kind of holidays in the Hamptons and the big houses. And so Ellen has this constant pull that she still wants to be. She doesn't want to necessarily be the blue-collar wife. And so it's all those kind of unspoken things in a marriage that cause like kind of frictions and tensions. And her trying to play the hostess. And there's that drunk scene in the movie where Hooper comes round. And then they go and cut open the shark. It's very different in the book because it's this hilarious dinner party where Brody gets more and more drunk as Ellen tries to entertain the dignitaries of the town and stuff. And so it's like good kind of dark pathos to it. But yeah, so I think it's a brilliant book. Yeah, but it adds a different frisson when on the boat, Hooper is also like Brody, pretty sure like he's doing away with having an affair with his wife. So
yeah, it's quality writing, that one. So Dan, what's your writing schedule?
I'm not sure I would call it a schedule as such, because I don't have that luxury of time. I have different periods in the past had that, and I'm a big fan of kind of routine if you can build it in, and similar time of day and like similar rituals to kind of help you trigger into writing and things like that, and thinking about how you manage the time. But in truth, like I have a young family, I have business, I travel around and stuff. You've got other responsibilities. It's very rare I have the luxury to kind of sit down and go, here's my writing block for 3 hours. And, I've written a lot of my books just traveling, like in airports and sitting on trains and in hotel rooms by myself after dinner. And now as well, with lockdown and things like that, it's like, being able to make the most of time whenever you can get. I believe you are what you do consistently. So if you think you're a writer, well, the question is are you writing consistently? And I'm not pretty sanguine about like how much you write or what your routine is. The fact is, if you do something consistently, even in small amounts compound over time. So generally I kind of like track a little bit of word count and want to write about 250,000 words a year. And that might manifest in 2 or 3 books some years, and other years, like this year, is probably just going to be one decent length 100k novel, and then about 4 books that I wrote about 15 or 20,000 words and didn't progress them. And it might be some short stories, it might be a novella. But the fact is, if you just can consistently write, you have a good routine, whatever it is, the side product will be books. And that's kind of what I kind of tell people. It's like, I teach writing, research writing, as we were saying before the call. I always tell people, your job is not to write a PhD or to write research papers or write a novel. Your job really is to build a thesis writing factory, the output of which just happens to be books. And if you think about it, factories, again, if we think metaphor, some people creative people get alienated by that. But think about it as a process or a practice or a craft. Like if you were a Renaissance artist, I mean, Renaissance art studios were like models for people like Henry Ford, right? They had more, and look at someone like Damien Hirst. He runs like a Renaissance style art factory, right from idea development, right, the kind of input to the system, refinement, development, production, sales, marketing. He has the whole shtick, right, and he's systematized it, and he has multiple people working under him as well,
Right.
people like James Patterson and things like that. You don't have to take it to that kind of extreme of like everything is dialed in and all that kind of stuff. And like, I don't have the luxury of writing full time, and even if I did, I'm not sure I'd write all day anyway. So my thing is just like, look at my week. Okay, I've got 45 minutes here. I might have 2 hours there. I might have to do half an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. Well, no, I always tell people, like, no one cares you're writing a novel, right? And nor should they. Right? No one cares about your work in progress. They might say nice things, but they don't really care, because like, the world's full of schmucks that started a book and never finished it, right? It's just dime a dozen, right? So all that external motivation stuff is very, very unuseful for the day to day. So you just got to like, do you believe you're a writer, right? Most things come from that status of belief, right? Even if you're just doing it for yourself, which might come to as a kind of point later. Like, everything formally like stems from there, right? And then the question is how do you do it consistently and regularly and get better at it? Everything else is just bespoke, personalized detail. So I write whenever and wherever I get the opportunity, basically, actually, and I try and do it most days a week. And I don't beat myself up if I miss a day. You just do another day.
Yeah, I think that not beating yourself up is one of the key things, because life does get in the way quite a lot of the time. Which is most important to you then? Is it plot or character?
I think this is a really good question. I've seen how other people have answered it, and I'm going to do the very academic thing of saying I'm going to undermine the premises of the question and say that they're not different. They're the same thing. They're the two sides of a coin. So the way I view it is that plot is external. It's the physical world. It's the actions and events of people, and whatever the world throws at a plot, that through which a character has to move, right? Character mirrors that in terms of it is the character's response. Now, broadly speaking, I agree with a kind of someone like John York, who's got a wonderful book on plot called Into the Woods.
Yes.
A fantastic book. That really, you have 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional characters, right? So what's the difference? 2-dimensional character, there is still change, right? But it's not at the psychological level of the character. Like, we see the difference between what they want and what they need. That's a classic way of characterizing. Character starts off thinking they want something, but they have a truer need that by the end of the book they need to realize. We'll come back to that. That's 3-dimensional. 2-dimensional is much more on the level of information. So think of a detective that doesn't really change. Okay, Poirot isn't going through some psychological transformation, catharsis, right? The issue is uncovering the mystery, right? And so normally, like, the midpoint would be a key clue and revelation, right? And there's a classic plotting thing in them, and you might not even realize at the time, but normally for the investigator, that's where an essential clue will be dropped. Okay, so a 3-dimensional one is where the character will change, and that midpoint, if you believe in midpoints, not everybody does, would be the moment where the thesis and the antithesis of character change has its hinge. Okay, so you get writers like what's his name? He wrote a book called Superstructure and Writing Your Novel from the Middle, and I can't remember his name now. Great books. Anyway, sorry.
No, I was just agreeing with you. It sounds like a great book, but I'm not sure.
Writing a novel from the middle, I can probably find it quite quickly. Is a really good concept. I'll find it on Amazon. Bear with us, kids. Nearly there. Technology and my weakening memory. James Scott Bell. Yeah, he's got a whole series of quite short books. Great book on dialogue. Another one on what he calls superstructure, which is another way of looking at beats. And this really good book, the best book I think, is Writing the Novel from the Middle. And he talks about, like, again, he personifies that kind of that hinge, right, as often a reflective moment where the person looks at themselves. If you look at a movie like Citizen Kane,
right.
there's that very famous shot of him being half in shadow and half in light.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a Children of Men has a wonderful midpoint as well, where Clive, what's his name? I can't remember his name. British actor. Anyway, he's on one side. He's the protagonist.
Yeah, Clive Owen.
Clive Owen. He's on one side of the screen, and he is like a shadow of his former self, and he's trying to help. He's trying to do a good thing, even though he's maybe not such a good man. And on the other side is Michael Caine, and they're literally in the woods, okay, at a hash farm in the woods. And Michael Caine is in light with a group of other people, part of whom Clive Owen's characters tried to help. And Michael Caine is telling the group the good man, the great man that Clive Owen used to be, right? And so he's literally faced with his former self and the kind of midpoint trying to get there with all his flaws. So it's a wonderful, like, absolutely bang in the middle of the movie. Movies are often good for this. You can do the same in novels. Anyway, so we're talking about the difference between character and plot. So for me, the two aren't really different. You know, if you're thinking about plot in a two-dimensional narrative, you know, your characters not really going to change, but probably around the midpoint at some point, they're going to have revelations of, well, not all the way through. It's basically about the uncovering of the mystery. And that's the change that goes through. It's from lack of knowledge to knowledge, basically. And then, but in a three-dimensional narrative where you're interested in character change, you know, plot is a reaction point, physical reaction point of the real world for the character to bounce off against, right? So you often, like, again, I would look at, like, you have an action beat often followed by a reflection beat, okay? So it's like something forces the character to do something. That can be an event in the world, an earthquake, a mysterious happening, a car crash. It could be the action of an individual, deliberate, you know, the monster pursuing or doing something, you know, if it was a horror or whatever. And then, you know, there's going to be, the person has to survive that, has to move on, has to problem solve with that. Often in the first half of the knowledge, they'll try and solve the problem with their faulty approach, okay? They're trying to respond to their wants rather than their needs, okay? And, you know, by the midpoint, they start to kind of move more to reacting more to what they need, move towards what they need rather than what they want, but they'll have, you know, setbacks. You know, they'll refer to type, and that'll usually be, you know, end of the fourth act, all is lost. Oh no, you know, I've been mistaken. I've been trying to do this the new way, and I should have just stayed at home. But you can't go home anymore. So get off your ass and fight the monster, or pursue love. You know, if it's a romance, it's the same thing. That's the moment where the love triangle, the person picks the wrong lover, and the other person finds out, and it looks like they can never be with their true love.
Would it be fair then to say that you're saying that for character, you would look at a story as being going from a state of lack of knowledge to possessing knowledge, but for plot, it's almost like we're going to Todorov's equilibrium, disruption, disequilibrium, and then back to a renewed equilibrium?
Yeah, like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, basically. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Absolutely. I think all fiction is essentially thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and there's not, you know, there's a reason why the Greeks logos comes from the mythos, right?
Yeah.
Historically speaking, and it's also like why a lot of like scientific papers and stuff are basically have a 5-act structure, even though they don't know it, right? Because it's a thesis, antithesis structure, and Francis Bacon adapted the classical rhetoric, which is based on a didactic model, right, which is the Socratic model, basically, and a Socratic model, if anyone's read, not everyone's read Socrates and Plato or Xenophon, but that method of disputation was storytelling. It was Plato or Xenophon putting Socrates in a story and him having like a back and forward with other characters and things happening, and it was literally a thesis, antithesis, synthesis through storytelling.
Excellent stuff. So what piece of writing advice would you give to anybody who's just starting out?
Oh, just starting out. Okay, so I suppose there's kind of two, I think, are kind of essential. One's psychological and one's one's more kind of a practical thing. The first one is, I kind of mentioned it before, which is about, do you believe you're a writer? But fundamentally, like, whether or not you believe you're a writer, professional or otherwise, write for yourself first.
Yeah.
Not yourself, the writer, because that can be self-indulgent and narcissistic. And we've all read books that, come out like that.
Oh,
but
yeah.
write for yourself, the reader, because you probably are usually more, critical in your tastes and stuff like that. And if you do that just because you love writing, or there's something, love is not, or joy is not always the right, I think the right word, rewarding is probably the better word, because writing can be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
But it's rewarding at a deeper level. It's like, you did an 11K run this morning, Ash. Just before you get on the treadmill, you're like, what am I about to do? Like, during it, you're like, this is kind of sore. And then, you get off and you get the endorphins and you go, oh, that's great. And I would say, like, writing is often like being a low level sadomasochist, right? In that those of us that kind of write most days, learn, it's like, working out. I work out a lot as well. I enjoy the discomfort. I'm a martial artist as well, and I have 3 black belts. And there's a phrase we have in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is, you got to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
And if you think you love writing, right, that's essentially what you are. You've got to kind of be at home. It's quite difficult to be in that headspace for protracted periods of time, because you're kind of working at and around your creative and intellectual limits. You're trying to push them all the time. So write for that, like, learn to enjoy that process of creativity, and write for yourself, because ultimately, if you do that, nothing else can hurt you. Yeah. Right? That's your route. If you're writing for other people, then other people's judgments always going to crush you. And that's not to say you shouldn't be critical and you shouldn't have an ear for, your writing teacher's feedback, or for your peers' feedback, or for, you get a piece published and some people like it and some people don't like it. If you're doing your job right, you're probably not going to please everybody all the time anyway. Yeah. You just want to please your kind of target audience, which for me is always other schmucks like me. My assumption is there's going to be some other schmucks in the world kind of like me, my kind of profile, my kind of tastes. If I can just find them, then they're probably going to like my work, right? And other people are going to detest it, and that's okay. But I write for me, right?
Yeah.
First of all, and then, like, screw everybody else after that. But I write for me, not the narcissist, to try not to do that. That's the battle. But me, the kind of critical reader who will put a book down after 50 pages because I'm like, no, it's just not doing it for me. Or like, I've trying to read King's Fairy Tale recently, and it seems to be a book that either people absolutely love and are weeing themselves over, or you're like me and you give up after 200 or 300 pages because you're just like, whoa, this is bloated and it's not going anywhere. And
oh, damn,
I can kind of see exactly where it's going. Yeah.
Oh.
And that's not to say it's a bad book. It's just not for me, right? But again, like me, I have certain tastes. So there you go. Did you read Fairy Tale?
No, I haven't read it yet. No, it's on my list of ones that I love King's stuff usually.
I love it. Yeah. Love them too. But not every book's going to land for you. I it's in the fantasy area, and like Talisman was another one where, I know that's with Peter Stroud, but like I got about 5th into that book and I was like, it's like, are we going to get going? And like, I don't really feel the same sense of impending threat and dread that I feel with the other books. And like the Dark Tower, I read the Dark Tower, I thought very clever, well written. I don't care, because I'm just not that into fantasy, and that's just a personal. Other people love it, right? And that's fantastic. So I think it was just that it was a fantasy novel, and it just wasn't for me. Yeah. So again, like, for yourself.
And no, to go back to your point about writing for yourself, I was talking to a group of students yesterday, and I was explaining that the night before, what I'd done was I was listening to one of my own audiobooks, just because I'd narrated it, I'd written the story, but it had been about a year, and I'd got sort of like enough distance where I could sit down and think, this is relatively new to me, and I'd quite enjoyed it. And I had one student turn around and say, you remind me of this bloke I used to know who used to film himself wanking. So I was saying, which part of my writing are you equating to? But she was talking about the narcissism of it. But yeah, sometimes it can seem narcissistic, but also if you're not writing a story that entertains you, in that case, yeah,
doing. Yeah, no, I would do the same. Like, not necessarily sit down and read the whole book sometimes, but I would go back in and read sections and go, "Oh, that was like better than I thought," or like, "Oh, I could do better than that now," but I still enjoyed that, like how it worked and stuff.
Yeah,
Like say, like writing a story, you inhabit that world in a way no one else gets to inhabit, really.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. We've already touched on this, but who do you read for pleasure?
Oh, lots of people, really. I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment, which is The Fisherman by John Langdon, which is
Right.
just absolutely exemplary. I'm kind of a third the way through it at the moment. That's one of those books that everyone recommends, but I haven't got around to reading. It's amazing. I love Stephen King most of the time. He's just occasionally, like everyone, like it's a novel where you're like, that didn't land for me. But he's
Yeah.
written so many things. I'm listening to James Herbert's Once on audiobook at the moment, and that's him really on form. And James Herbert's another one of those authors. Well, King's mostly almost always on target, and fantastic and the kind of genius of his generation. But Herbert is one of those ones that veers from like dreadful to like really amazing, really great, and
Yeah.
so his last book called, I think his last book he wrote called Ash,
Right.
or namesake, about the paranormal investigator. It was the last in the series. I thought it was awful, dreadful. Once, I think it's amazing. Sepulchre is a brilliant book.
Yeah.
The Rats are not technically fantastic, although they have moments of brilliance, but they're such fun books. Yeah, and then Herbert always has his faults. Like, I think he would have been a much better erotic writer. He's like a fantastic erotic writer.
Yeah.
Sometimes his eroticism really works thematically with the books. Like Sepulchre is very dark and BDSM-ish, and so it works really well. And like Once is very like a kind of, sometimes it's portrayed as like an erotic horror. And again, like thematically, the sex works really well with the book, and I don't object to it. But quite often, like Herbert's problem is that even in the 70s, his gender roles were dated, and like the women are often just there to give the guy a good shag at the end of the fourth act, to
Yeah.
pep him up for the fifth act, and they're just, kind of bits of fluff on the man's arm, and they've never any real depth. That's interesting about Once, is that actually it's one of the cases where he has actually written some women that you have a little bit of depth and oomph about them, which is unusual for Herbert because they're just normally never like that. So I like him. Paul Tremblay, normally I normally love. I wasn't a fan of Paul Bearer's Club, but normally I think he's amazing. Scott Carson, that's his pseudonym. He's Michael Corita as a thriller writer, and he's written a couple of great horror novels in the last couple of years as Scott Carson, The Chill and Where They Wait. I love Nick Cutter's stuff, who is a thriller writer. I can't remember what his name is as a thriller writer, but he wrote The Troop and The Deep, and then another one I've not read, but he writes really gross stuff like body horror. And his descriptions, I was reading The Troop and it made me nauseous in a couple of the chapters. It was the
You
description.
shouldn't grin when you're saying that. You should, oh,
Yeah.
really be good. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just actually he takes it to that. Some people hate that, like he's like a bit Marmite, I think, for people, and I don't always like his endings. I didn't like the ending of The Deep. I thought the rest of the book was fantastic, but I could kind of see what he was trying to do with the ending. Didn't totally spoil the book for me. Just wasn't how I wanted the ending to land. So I like him. Who else have I got on my shelves at the moment? I read Tim Leben a lot recently. He was really good. The Last Storm and Eden. I think he's a really good commercial horror writer. Last week I read Clay McCall Chapman's Ghost Eaters, which was brilliant. The books of Coley by M.R. Carey are really great dystopian ones. He's the girl on Girl with All the Gifts and The Boy on the Bridge. Loads, anything and everything, basically. Lots of stuff.
That's one hell of an eclectic reading list.
Yeah.
Right, so you've written short fiction and you've written long form fiction. Which do you prefer and why?
Oh, this is just remind me. Sorry, can we come back to that question? You were asking me about the advice for writers, and I said it was two parts, right?
God, yes, sorry. Yeah, there were two parts.
Yeah.
The practical part.
So
Yeah.
the first one was like for yourself. This links to the short fiction and the long fiction, so it'll be a nice segue back.
Cool.
The second part was like, again, a good phrase we got from martial arts, especially like judo, wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, is we say drillers are killers, right?
Right.
And a lot of writers don't drill, right? Drill skills are, you don't do something till you can get it right. You do something till you can't get it wrong, right? Don't drill something until you can get it right. Do it until you can't get it wrong. But do you know what your skills are? So I find when a lot of people are talking about writing, my background is as a linguist. That's kind of text linguist. That's what my PhD's in, analyzing political texts and stuff. You've got to define what you're analyzing, like what you're writing, like what are the composite skills. And there's a really good book I'd recommend called Finite and Infinite Games, philosophy book. But it's this idea that like life can be broken up into kind of two broad categories of finite and infinite games. And finite games are very much like, you know, writing a novel. Okay, it has a beginning, a middle, and end. You either do it or you don't do it. They're much more accessible, right? Obviously, an actual game, a football game, is a finite game, right? But lots of stuff around it is an infinite game. So I would say, like, writing itself broadly, how do you play the infinite game well? How do you just keep writing? Which links back into what we're saying about process, writing for yourself, trying to just, you know, you are what you do consistently. Not every time you sit down and write is it about pumping out a short story or pumping out a novel, right? It's about working on your craft or your skill. Now, there's a bunch of different ways of doing that. Short stories are a great way in. Stephen King on writing, that's a really great piece of advice he gives in that, is that there's a number of reasons why starting with short fiction makes a lot of sense. Again, from a kind of, if I coach people like a martial art, you don't just go, welcome to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or welcome to judo. Now go and fight someone really experienced and get thrown on your head or choked into submission like 10 times. Like, that's not a good experience for someone. They don't learn a lot, and only the weirdest of people are going to stay around, right? Okay, you maybe don't want that. What do? You break it down into its composite elements, right? So, you know, you might just start off with showing people footwork if you're doing judo, or how to grip the gi and why you grip the gi in that way. Then you'll start with a very basic or like common throw or whatever, and then you break that down into different sections and different pieces, right? So it's the same idea with writing. So what short stories allow you to do is focus on something essentially is like a chapter length, or maybe up to a few chapters length. Like, you can work on several skills with that. Like, you could just focus on characterization. You could just focus on like an interesting kind of plot, or scene weave, or developing your dialogue, or an opening image reflecting a closing image, right? You could work on your prose style. You could work on your flow. What characterizes flow? You know, sentence variety, or, you know, in particular voice, right? I'm mentioning lots and lots of different skills. Why a short story is easier for that is that cognitively, you've got a lot less to manage.
Yeah.
Working many of your core composite skills in a shorter amount. Like, you've written lots and lots of novels, you know, holding them in your head, like, you require much more complex planning skills, much more motivation. You know, you've got to grind that sucker out. They're much harder to edit. You know, you just got many more balls in the air, and you're balancing them, not just more skills, but the volume of the skills is huge. Which, if you take a short story, you could aim to write a 3,000 word short story. That's like, you know, two, maybe 3 chapters in a normal book for me.
Yeah.
If I write 5,000, okay, yeah, it's somewhere like 3 to 4 chapters typically. That's like a scene weave. That's a good skill to practice, right? You can practice different points of view. You can practice, you know, first person, second person, third person. Like, you can do all different, like, practice your intercranial. Do you want to switch points of view? Do you want to do one from a central? Do you want to do it in the present tense and the past tense, right? Do you want to mix genres? I mean, that's certainly what I did a lot with short stories, was fine. I didn't choose horror. I always say horror chose me. I just wrote lots of short stories that I had ideas for. One was a crime one initially. You know, I wrote some literary fiction, and then I had story ideas, and it wasn't until I started submitting to magazines that I found that it's actually horror magazines that were taking a lot of my stories. And it might seem stupid, but I was like, oh, I don't know where to put this story. And then I saw, like, randomly, like, a call for submissions for a magazine called Devolution Z. It's now defunct, but it was a really good little horror magazine for a few years. And I sent it in, and they accepted it, and they paid me money. And I was like, oh, I've got another story. Sent that in, and they accepted it and paid me more money. And I was like, oh, I've got loads more ideas like this. Maybe I write horror. Okay. But short stories just allow me to try out tons of different voices, tons of different ideas, tons of different genres, and try different skills. And you can write microfiction, you know, really, really short fiction, 100 words, 200 words, short story, 1,000 words to maybe 500, or then you got novelettes, maybe like kind of 5 to 10,000-ish words. And then we're getting in the realm of novellas, which can be as short as kind of, I would say normally around about 15,000 words, probably for a novella, up to what? That's a bit of a debate, 40, 50, 60,000 words, but certainly like sweet spot for novellas is probably in that kind of 20 to 40,000 words. So again, you can kind of build up if you want, but short stories allow you to do a lot of that and experience the industry, like submit to lots of different places, experience rejection. Yeah. Right? You're going to get rejected a lot. That's okay. And again, how you manage that is just part of that skill. It's just data. Right, and then you probably won't get feedback. Sometimes you will. Is it good feedback? Who knows? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And just keep trying and experimenting and getting your work out there in the world, and it helps build a little platform. Another thing I did is I wrote a couple of novels just to learn how not to write a novel. You know, yes. I wasn't going like, oh darling, I'm working on my magnum opus, and like, you know, it's really going to change the world, and like, you know, I think probably going to win the Booker Prize, whatever. Like, extreme arrogance if you've never written a novel before that your first one's going to be brilliant. Maybe it will be, but again, I just assume I'm a bit of a schmuck, and I'm probably going to have to, like, you know, have a bit of a work ethic. So I wrote a couple of kids novels initially. My kids were little, you play with them, you read a lot of stuff to them, just had a lot of ideas. And I thought, well, these are kind of shorter anyway, tend to be like 40, 50, 60,000 words. So I get to practice the form of a novel, characters, everything in there, right? Just on a slightly smaller scale. And I learned a lot about how not to write a novel, but I also learned a lot like what works, like how to, basic skills, like how to get your butt in a chair on a regular basis and do the work. Doesn't seem like a skill, but it's actually the foundational one.
It's, yeah, it is the found. Yeah, if you can't do that part, in that case, you can't write.
Yeah. And another thing that people don't do is, like, as you read, is I like to like pick a skill that a writer does well. It might be like they write brilliant similes. They have really great descriptive writing about what people look like and how that adds to the character or it adds to the plot. Track it through a novel. If you read on a Kindle, highlight it. You know, if you read in a paperback and you don't mind defacing books, just mark those sentences, right?
There's a law against that.
There's a law against that. Yeah, some people are for it and some people are against it. So do you, or, you know, keep a separate file, you know, you can kind of like dot them and then like write it up. But, you know, drillers are killers. You've got to focus on that skill. And then, like, you know, you can do quite cool things, which is like, look at opening sentences or look at opening paragraphs. Once you've read the book, could you rewrite that opening paragraph for that book? Could you rewrite this one page, this bit of dialogue between them from the way you want to write it, or use it as a model for one of your scenes? Like, emulate it, don't copy it, but use the kind of structure of it and break it down and see how they kind of flip backwards and forwards, and there's an underlying tension there. So you can kind of, you're not working on a story, you're not going to use it. Sorry, Ash, you.
Yeah, how I managed to get out of bed on a morning, I don't know. So yeah, love the phrase "drillers for killers." That's just, yeah, and the whole notion that we should be writing not so that we've developed the skill, but so that we can't get rid of that skill. That must be one hell of a thing within the martial arts industry then. That yeah, is this how you ended up with 3 black belts?
Yeah, I mean, just like you drill, and you learn a lot about learning if you do a lot of martial arts. I always say, like, I started with a martial art called Shrinji Kempo, and most of the Japanese martial arts, just because of where they come out of Japan in the late 1800s and who established them. And this whole historical thing about moving from kind of the shogun to a kind of more less medieval system of government. You get this thing called Budo, and that's the way. So they take Jitsu, which were all the old martial styles, and you've got all these samurai cutting around with these skills, and they're basically brutes, and they want to socialize and civilize them, right? So they move to the Budo, which is like trying to take the martial arts skills and then use them as like tools for social development, like development of the individual and the development of the society. And a lot of the people that established those, like a guy like Jingoro Kano, who established judo, was an educator. I think he had a PhD.
Right.
And he was also from a samurai family, and he kind of synthesized whole loads of different skills of jiu-jitsu together and then codified them with all these kind of various masters under this one like umbrella, and that led to what's called modern judo. But if you look at how the judo syllabus is broken down, or any of those martial arts that come from that period, like karate or kempo or aikido, people like Morihei Shiba, syllabus wise, whether or not the martial arts are good or not good for whatever you want them to do, you learn a lot about learning just from the syllabus, the way they categorize techniques together, the way they think about how someone learns from having no knowledge to becoming expert, and all these kind of things. So it was one I learned from Shunji Kempo, which was, we used to do philosophy exams in it, and this Japanese idea of, they call 3 levels of learning, Shu, Ha, Ri, which is learn, adapt, master. Right, and so in the learning phase, you're literally copying. You're quite copying naively, and it always says just try and focus on not just the details, but the principles of what you're doing, like why you're doing it and how it works. What's the deeper underlying principles? Adaptation comes as like an early stage of mastery, where you start to, if it's martial arts, you adapt to. You don't just learn blindly. You start thinking, well, my body type is like this. Like I'm a 6'2", 95 kilo man with quite long legs and reasonably long arms, right? So certain throws suit me quite well. If you're a short guy with short legs, certain other throws suit you, or a woman, right? So you start to think, and you also got like your personality, or you're quite aggressive, or you're quite passive. So what suits you? And you start to then adapt the techniques and like tweak them to fit your game, as it were. We often refer to it as your game. And then there comes a level of where you basically internalize so many of the principles, you start to add something of yourself to that. And then you can really look at any like thing you need to learn in that same kind of like learn, adapt, master thing. And then normally the thing I add to that is like certain things in any system are far more important foundationally than anything else, and they're usually things that come to like the principles, or their frequency happens much more often. So like same with writing, kind of I approached writing in a very, very similar way. It's like break it down. When I came to creative writing quite late, probably in my early 30s, started working on it. Like break it down, like identify the skills you're trying to learn, try and identify what the most important skills are to learn and why they're important, and then like drill them. Like it's not complicated. Like a meta learning skill is stubbornness. All right, some people got it grit. I just think like, you're just stubborn. I want to do this, I really like it, and I'm prepared to be bored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So taking me back to the question I just asked before then, so short fiction or long form fiction, which do you prefer?
Okay, so like I kind of use short fiction as a kind of learning tool. I don't read a lot of short fiction, even though I'm dyslexic and things like that. I prefer long fiction. I just prefer books. I find short fiction often very unsatisfying, except when it's not. And then when it's not, it's amazing, and it's as good as anything else, right?
Yeah.
So I haven't written a lot of short fiction for a while, and I always keep meaning to go back to it because it's a related skill, but it is different, right? From when you get into longer form, like there are certain things like I think the suspension of disbelief kind of is slightly easier in a short story, like a reader, or you don't have to work to kind of build the world quite so much, or you've got to be much more efficient in a short story. So in another way to do short stories really well is not an easy thing. It's not easier than, say, writing a novel, in that to make them exemplary.
Yeah.
There's, and King again talks about bouncing between the two and often having to kind of relearn the kind of muscles, remember some of the muscles for short fiction and bringing it in closer. So generally I would say long fiction is what I would default to now, but always thinking I need to go back and write some short stories. Just often my ideas now tend to be bigger, And sometimes you find like, oh, this idea is a short story idea. There aren't as many layers to it. It's not so much complexity to it. And at the moment, I think I'm more interested in writing novels. So I don't know, the ideas I seem to be kind of generating in my notebooks. I'm always thinking more towards novels or maybe novellas. Yeah. So long fiction.
Not a bad place to be, that. Aside from writing gritty horror that's filled with uncomfortable realism, you also write for a younger audience. How do you differentiate between these two disparate audiences?
Got the spooks, many an illustration. I mean, I suppose on one technical level, there's a language level. You know, if you write for an audience of a certain age, you've got to be aware of like their level of literacy. This one I wrote for a kind of low middle grade. Like, so in terms of content, it's called The Spooks. I aimed these stories. I kind of just set myself. This is probably the last set of short stories I wrote. Actually, I kind of set myself a challenge couple of years ago of just writing a short story every day for a month, 5 days a week. So I kind of ended up writing about 21, I think, in the month. And then 17 of them kind of I felt were good enough, or I rewrote to be this collection of short stories. And I just thought, I'll write it for kids. I'll do about 1,000 words a day. So the first part is I just generated tons and tons of ideas, and then I wrote them. So I wanted them to be for like reluctant readers. So I'm thinking very much about word choice and sentence complexity. So if you're writing for functionally literate people, that essentially means you need to focus on the 5,000 most frequently used words in the English language, or any language for that matter. That 5,000 most frequently used words is 90% of comprehension. So someone who's functionally literate, that's usually seen as someone who's around about 10 years old, give or take. So it could be as low as 8. Doesn't mean you can't use a more complicated word, but you've got to work for it to be contextually understandable for them and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's quite an interesting limit, because you can't, throw a kind of adverb at it, which the road to hell is paved with adverbs, as the king said. Yeah. Those kind of things. So yeah, limiting in sentence length. Newspapers are a good guide. Most straight newspaper stories are written for a functionally literate audience. So that's around about 8 to 10 years old, and they'll do that. And you can look at their sentence construction, and their paragraph lengths are going to be very short. So you're probably not looking at sentences that go much over 8 to 10 words most of the time. So you're kind of in that kind of threshold. And then in terms of ideas, like there's a lot more you can do with kids than people think. I think, a lot of horror, I think, stems from childhood. And like, if you really, we often remember the great things about childhood. And I have lots of huge fond memories of my childhood, and I had a relatively untroubled childhood, lovely, loving family background, grew up without poverty and all those kind of things, and any other strictures that could have been placed on me by the arbitrariness of my birth. And yet I spent most of my childhood, I feel, incredibly anxious and terrified of things, right? Like, and I think most kids are in that, like the whole world is alien and strange, and you're learning it. And so you can pull on those kind of things. And I think kids in some senses will be more accepting of things. You don't have to break down their inhibitions for them to believe it. That belief comes much more naturally, but it's also a much more scary thing. Whereas adults, you've got to spend a lot more time kind of establishing the world, building character, and then like chipping away at their defenses.
Yeah, that actually leads me so neatly onto the next question I've got as well, because you've written a broad range of horror covering different topics within the genre. What scares you the most?
I suppose like there's different levels to that. Existentially, I would say social media and artificial intelligence driven algorithms are like, certainly in like Western democracies, the thing that we should be worried about the most, and that we're doing this huge social experiment. And the Reformation came out of the invention of the book, right? And then that led to 200-300 years of political strife. And I live in Northern Ireland, which is really, one way of looking at it, is the end of the Reformation, right? Still bubbling on here, sectarian violence, right? And that was the invention of the book. So what's the Tinternet going to do? And I just think like we're doing huge social experiments, you know, that we don't really know what's happening. I think we're afraid to regulate tech and say like you've got to know what's going on. There's not enough accountability in the system. All for, and you know, if you've got basically algorithms that are optimizing for attention, and it's like get attention however you can. Well, we've already seen like the results of what that's producing, and it's not good. It's a dystopia now. You know, the culture wars and everything else. It's like, you know, no, like this is, everyone has a difference of opinion. Strength of the system is tolerating people's opinions and being able to have a bit of banter backwards and forth, and not siloing yourself and believing absolutely. Like in some stuff, like it's not any different. Like, you know, it's the 80s again, isn't it, right now? You know, it was bad Russians, nukes, and high inflation, right? And we all hate it. And I remember growing up in a kind of really Tory area, but my parents were always like, oh gosh, the bloody Tories. I was like, yeah, the bloody Tories. And I'm like, where are they? Everywhere, like where I live, right? But like, oh, and they're my friends and stuff like that. And there's just like sometimes a civility of discourse that we're at a meta level, a societal level, that we're losing the ability to have civil discourse, or the ability to have arguments and it's be okay, like for us to disagree and have a good ding dong of an argument, but like you don't then think, oh, me and Ash disagree on like how to organize the political economy of the UK, not that either of us have any stake in actually changing it. Well, I think like, you know, Ash is now a kind of Marxist, and you know, that's not, no, anyway, you see what I'm getting at. Algorithm.
The algorithms, they sort of like put us, it's you end up in an echo chamber of your own thoughts, don't you?
Yeah.
So the whole notion, you only encounter basically it's just trolls that you encounter for
I think so many bots, you know, and you don't even know what's real and those kind of things. So it's like, you know, everyone's going, oh, it's terrible. You're going to need, I like Twitter, but you go on Twitter and people are losing their minds. And then you look outside and go, I live in a lovely place with a lovely family, and I have lots of nice relationships with lots of people. And like, that's just not my life. And I'm sure it's some people's life. But then we get into kind of some strange psychological territory. You know, like Zygmunt Bauman, the German sociologist, the book about liquid modernity. He talks about, you know, what mostly like rich people do is live their anxieties through the poor, but have no real interest in actually helping them. It's just like they don't have any real anxieties of themselves, so they, you know, they borrow them from other people. But anyway, so I would say like existentially, that's one level. I suppose there's like a personal level where, like, if I think about my family, lots of people say if you've got kids, like anything happening to your kids. Yeah. I think the most terrifying things for a parent is not, you know, kids dying and stuff would be terrible, but the idea of a child being taken. That's the kind of premise of Nick Cutter's book, The Deep. Oh, and that will be like, you know, the kind of Madeleine McCann type situation would just be a living, unending hell for a parent.
Yeah, there's no closure on that, is there?
There's no closure on that, and there's just the whole hell of imagination of what's happened and is it still happening, and that you're supposed to have been responsible and protecting. So I think that's another level. And then I suppose on a purely personal level, that kind of thing that gives you the shudder. Yeah, I don't know. Being alone. Like, I think if really, like, the one thing that humans are not set up to deal with is being alone. Like, it's not going to give you a jump scare, but if suddenly there was no one else on the planet, how long would you survive before you went mad?
I can so relate to that because, yeah, I mean, we've talked about audiobooks, and yeah, when I go to the gym, I've got an audiobook shoved in my ear things. When I go for a drive, I'm listening to an audiobook. I've even got I've even got speakers in the shower so I can listen to audiobooks whilst I'm there, almost as though I need the reassuring voice of a storyteller there, just so that I'm on my own. Yeah,
absolutely. And it links back to the first one, the existential one. That so much of us are like, people aren't comfortable with just being with themselves. Like, you have to learn to sit with yourself sometimes, and as being a writer, to kind of bring it back on the writing thing.
Yeah,
one of the things you're going to do as a writer is you're going to spend a lot of time in your own head. You know, a lot of writers have mental health problems and stuff, and I'm sure that's like, you know, usually quite introverted. I'm not personally, but a lot of writers are very introverted, quite sensitive because they're creatives, they're very open, psychologically speaking. And one of the things you've got to learn to do is to be able to sit with yourself and be comfortable with yourself and not necessarily need stimulating. And it's hard. It's super hard. It's like, again, it's like probably bringing those two things together. It's maybe the meta problem of an affluent society is contentment. It's very philosophical for writing. Writing.
Sounds right. But yeah, my final question. What are you currently working on, and where can we find more of your work?
Find more of my work on Amazon if you're interested in ebooks and stuff, and paperbacks are there, and paperbacks are distributed more widely. So just go on Barnes and Noble or Waterstones or wherever, they'll stock them, or you can order them in. My website, dansoule.com. Yeah, short one, dansoule.com. You have to check that. It's a very nice site as well. You can get a bunch of free books. I give away 3 classic horror books: Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, Frankenstein, and then a collection of like 2 short story anthologies of my work. So that's kind of where you can find me there. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and places like that. Writer Dan Soule in all those places. What I'm working on at the moment is I've had a bit of a rocky year writing because I had COVID November last over a year ago, and I just had terrible brain fog after it, coming up for a year ago. So it'll be a year in November, end of November. And I found it so hard just to push novels past the kind of first act. I get to the first act, oh, this is really good, and then we're like, don't know where it's going. It just felt like mentally there was a block, like a fog. I always think like, you throw lots of balls up in the air in the first act, and I plan and plot a lot, and I just couldn't see how I was going to catch the balls or anything. Like it, just a fog, like that's the best way to describe it. So I'm kind of pushing through on this book I'm working on at the moment, which is called, has a working title of Across the Dunes. And yeah, it's kind of a sort of a legend / fairy tale set now. So it's a father and son kind of narrative, and they have to cross the dunes, but something is there that won't let them cross it, and it's should be quite a big, fairly epic novel. It's kind of like a town. It's set in a town that's sort of trapped in a kind of liminal state between the kind of magical realm and real world, and they kind of exist in both, but no one in the town can really leave except this one family who are historically the kind of lords of the manor, and they're the ones that have to cross the dunes whenever the eldest son reaches the age of 15, and the father and son have to cross the dunes, and for that the family gets immense luck and privilege, and it solidifies the success of the town for the next generation until the following son has to do the same with their son. But there's lots of loss, and there's a reason why they have to do this. I don't know if you know the kind of like Herne the Hunter and Cenosus, kind of like the antler god of the wood in European mythology, ancient European mythology. So I'm playing on that and the horned serpent. So there's a whole kind of fairy tale / legend that underpins it that's kind of magical, that will be revealed through the story. That's the idea. I could get halfway through and it screws up and I'll be on another project, but I'm hoping not.
Oh, I hope not. I can't wait to read this one. Dan, thank you so much for your time. I know my students are really, really going to get an awful lot out of that. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Ash. That's great.